A crash in the wilderness. John had always loved the quiet of his cabin. Nestled deep in the wilderness, it was a place where he could escape the noise of the world and his own troubled past. A retired combat medic, he had chosen this life to find peace. But tonight, peace was the last thing he would get. The night sky lit up with an eerie blue flash, followed by a deafening crash that shook the ground beneath his feet. John bolted upright from his chair on the porch, his instincts kicking in. That wasn't a thunderstorm or a falling tree. It was something else, something unnatural. Grabbing his flashlight and rifle, he headed into the forest to investigate. The forest was alive with sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant calls of nocturnal animals, and something new, a faint mechanical whirring mixed with crackling electricity. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a trail of broken branches and scorched earth. Whatever had fallen, it was big and not from this world. As he got closer, John's breath caught. In a small clearing lay a pod-like structure, partially embedded in the ground. Smoke billowed from its sides, and strange symbols glowed faintly on its hull. The material wasn't metal, at least not any kind John recognized. He approached cautiously, his rifle at the ready. Suddenly, a soft, pained moan reached his ears. John froze, his heart racing. It wasn't just debris. Someone was inside. Moving closer, he saw a hatch on the side of the pod. It had been forced open, and inside, slumped against the wall, was a figure. It was an alien, no doubt about it. The being was humanoid, but with pale lavender skin and eyes that shimmered like liquid silver. She was badly injured, clutching her side where blood. If that glowing blue liquid was blood, seeped through her fingers. Beside her, a smaller figure peeked out, a child, barely half her size, with wide, frightened eyes. John hesitated, his training and instincts at war. He didn't know what kind of creatures they were, or if they posed a threat. But the medic in him couldn't ignore the obvious. They needed help. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and knelt beside the alien woman. "Can you understand me?" he asked, his voice steady but cautious. The woman's eyes fluttered open. She looked at him, her gaze full of pain and desperation. "Help, please," she whispered, her voice faint but clear. The child clung to her, trembling. John didn't waste time. He quickly assessed her injuries. A deep gash ran along her side, and her breathing was labored. She had burns on her arms, likely from the crash. He reached into his bag for his first aid kit, though he wasn't sure how effective human medicine would be. The child whimpered as John began to clean the wounds. "It's okay," he said softly, not sure if they could understand him. "I'm here to help." The woman winced but didn't resist. Her eyes never left his face, as if she were trying to read his intentions. "Danger, coming," she muttered, her voice weak. "Must hide, child." John glanced around the forest, his senses on high alert. "What kind of danger?" he asked, but the woman's head lolled to the side, unconscious. The child tugged at his sleeve, pointing toward the forest. John followed the direction of the tiny finger and froze. In the distance, faint but unmistakable, were glowing eyes, several pairs of them, moving through the trees. "Great," he muttered, quickly wrapping the woman's wounds as best as he could. He lifted her into his arms, surprised at how light she was despite her height. "We need to get out of here," he said to the child, who nodded, seemingly understanding his urgency. The journey back to his cabin was a tense one. The glowing eyes trailed them, staying just out of reach, but close enough to remind him they weren't safe. The child kept glancing over his shoulder, her small hand clutching his jacket. When they finally reached the cabin, John locked the door and set the woman down on the couch. The child hovered nearby, her eyes darting between her mother and the windows. John grabbed his rifle and peered outside. The glowing eyes were closer now, circling the perimeter. "This is bad," he muttered under his breath. He wasn't sure what those creatures were, but they didn't look friendly. And they weren't going away. The alien woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open again. She grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Protect, child," she rasped. "They hunt us." John nodded, his jaw tightening. He didn't know who or what these beings were, but he wasn't about to let them get inside. Not while he was breathing. As the creatures began scratching at the windows, their glowing eyes filled with menace, John steadied his rifle. He had survived worse odds before. This time, he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was protecting an injured mother and her child. And he wasn't going to let them down. The pursuit. John's cabin wasn't built for war, but tonight, it would have to hold. The alien woman lay unconscious on the couch, her shallow breaths the only sign she was still alive. The child, barely waist-high and trembling, clung to his jacket like a lifeline. John had barricaded the windows with whatever furniture he could move, but the sounds outside told him it might not be enough. The scratching at the windows had turned into heavy thuds. Whatever was out there wasn't just testing the cabin's defenses. It was trying to break in. "Stay quiet," John whispered to the child. Her shimmering silver eyes locked onto his, brimming with fear. He knelt down to her level, placing a reassuring hand on her small shoulder. "I'm going to keep you both safe. I promise." The child nodded, her tiny hands gripping the glowing pendant around her neck. It pulsed faintly, casting the soft blue light that illuminated the dark room. John didn't know what it was, but the way she held it told him it was important. A loud crash snapped his attention back to the door. The wood groaned under the weight of something heavy pressing against it. He grabbed his rifle, his military training taking over. His mind raced as he calculated his options. He had no backup, no idea what kind of creatures he was dealing with, and 2 lives depending on him. Through the flickering candlelight, the alien woman stirred, her hand weakly reaching for him. "Protect, child," she rasped, her voice barely audible. "I'm working on it," John muttered, gripping his rifle tighter. Then the first crack appeared in the door. A jagged claw punched through the wood, splintering it like paper. John fired a warning shot, the deafening sound echoing through the small cabin. The claw retracted, but he knew it wouldn't be for long. He turned to the child. "We need to move. Do you understand?" The child hesitated but then nodded, her eyes filled with a newfound determination. She pointed toward the back of the cabin, where a small hatch led to an underground cellar. It wasn't much, just a storage space for food and supplies, but it would buy them time. "Smart kid," John said, nodding. He quickly lifted the unconscious woman into his arms and gestured for the child to follow. They descended into the cellar, the heavy door shutting behind them just as another crash shook the cabin above. The cellar was cramped and damp, with only a single lantern providing light. John placed the woman gently on the ground, checking her pulse. It was weak but steady. The child knelt beside her, clutching her hand and whispering in a language John didn't understand. The words sounded melodic, almost like a lullaby. "All right, let's think," John muttered to himself, pacing the small space. The creatures above weren't going to stop, and the cabin wouldn't hold forever. He needed a plan. His eyes fell on the child's glowing pendant. "What is that thing?" he asked, crouching down beside her. The child hesitated, then held the pendant up. "Help," she said in a small, trembling voice. John frowned. "Help? How?" Before he could ask more, the pendant began to glow brighter, casting intricate patterns of light onto the walls. The air in the cellar grew warmer, and a low hum filled the space. John instinctively stepped back, his rifle raised, as the pendant projected a holographic map into the air. It showed the forest surrounding the cabin, marked with glowing symbols. One symbol, a bright green dot, pulsed steadily about a mile away. "What's that?" John asked, pointing to the green dot. The child looked at him, her expression serious. "Safe." John's mind raced. If the map was right, there was some kind of safe zone nearby. But getting there meant leaving the cabin and braving the creatures outside. He glanced at the unconscious woman. Moving her in her condition would be risky, but staying here was a death sentence. Above them, the thuds grew louder. The creatures had breached the cabin and were now searching for them. Their guttural growls sent chills down John's spine. "All right," he said, making up his mind. "We're going to that safe zone. But you need to stay close to me, understand?" The child nodded, clutching the pendant tightly. John fashioned a makeshift stretcher from supplies in the cellar, carefully placing the woman onto it. He tied the ends to his shoulders, distributing her weight evenly so he could carry her and still use his rifle if needed. As he opened the hatch, the cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the faint sound of snarls. The forest was dark, but the map from the pendant projected a faint green path, showing them the way. "Let's move," John whispered. They crept through the forest, the child's small hand gripping his tightly. The pendant's light was their only guide, casting eerie shadows on the trees. The growls grew fainter as they moved further from the cabin, but John knew the creatures wouldn't give up that easily. Halfway to the safe zone, the child suddenly froze, tugging on his arm. "Wait," she whispered, her voice urgent. John turned, his heart pounding. Behind them, a pair of glowing eyes emerged from the darkness, followed by another and another. The creatures had found them. "Run," John shouted, lifting the stretcher and breaking into a sprint. The child clung to his side as the forest came alive with the sound of pursuit. Branches snapped and leaves rustled as the creatures closed in, their guttural growls echoing all around them. The green dot on the map grew closer, but so did the creatures. John's legs burned with effort, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could feel the woman's weight pressing down on him, slowing him, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Just as the creatures were almost upon them, the pendant's light flared, blindingly bright. A force field erupted around them, sending the creatures skittering back with furious howls. John collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. The child knelt beside him, her pendant dimming back to its soft glow. "Safe," she said softly, pointing ahead. Through the trees, John saw it, a shimmering dome of light, pulsing gently in the darkness. The safe zone. They had made it, but he knew this was only the beginning of their fight. Trust in the unknown. The shimmering dome of light provided a brief moment of reprieve, but John couldn't shake the feeling of unease as they stepped inside. The force field that had saved them from the pursuing creatures hummed faintly, encasing them in an otherworldly glow. It wasn't just a shelter, it was alien technology far beyond anything John had seen before. The child tugged at his jacket, her silver eyes scanning the area with equal parts relief and fear. She pointed to a central platform at the heart of the dome. It glowed faintly, pulsating with energy, as if it were alive. "What is this place?" John muttered under his breath. The child didn't respond, her small hands clutching the glowing pendant as though it were her lifeline. John gently laid the alien woman on the smooth floor of the dome, his makeshift stretcher no longer needed. She was still unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. The child knelt beside her mother, whispering in their melodic alien language. John couldn't understand the words, but the emotion behind them was clear. Pleas for her to wake up, to stay with them. He crouched down, placing a hand on the woman's wrist to check her pulse. It was faint, but it was there. He knew she needed more than his rudimentary medical skills. Human first aid wasn't designed for alien biology, and his limited supplies wouldn't last long. "Kid," John said softly, looking at the child. "Is there something here that can help her? A machine? Medicine? Anything?" The child hesitated, then looked at him with a mix of trust and doubt. Slowly, she pointed to the platform at the center of the dome. John frowned, studying the strange structure. It was smooth and seamless, like it had grown out of the ground rather than being built. Symbols he didn't recognize pulsed faintly along its surface. "All right," he said, standing up. "Worth a shot." As he approached the platform, The pendant in the child's hands began to glow brighter. The symbols on the platform responded, lighting up in a cascading wave of energy. John stepped back instinctively, gripping his rifle, but the child didn't seem alarmed. Instead, she placed the pendant on her mother's chest and looked at John expectantly. "You want me to?" John gestured to the platform, unsure. The child nodded, her expression serious. Taking a deep breath, John reached out and touched the surface of the platform. It was warm, almost alive, and the moment his fingers made contact, a surge of energy rushed through him. The symbols flared to life, and a soft hum filled the air. Before his eyes, the platform transformed, shifting and reshaping itself into what looked like a medical station. A cradle-like structure emerged, its surface lined with faintly glowing lights. The child pointed at it, then at her mother. "You want me to put her in that?" John asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. The child nodded again, her small hands gesturing urgently. John hesitated for a moment, then carefully lifted the alien woman and placed her onto the cradle. The moment her body settled into it, the lights around the cradle intensified, scanning her from head to toe. A holographic display appeared above her, filled with symbols and diagrams John couldn't begin to decipher. The child stepped forward, her small fingers moving in precise motions through the holograms. It was as if she had done this before. The machine responded to her commands, adjusting the lights and sounds around the cradle. "Impressive," John muttered, watching the child work. "You're smarter than you look." As the machine began its work, John took a step back, letting the child handle what he couldn't. He kept his rifle close, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the dome. The creatures might have been driven back for now, but he doubted they'd give up so easily. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The alien woman's breathing grew steadier, her complexion less pale. The glowing blue blood on her side began to fade, replaced by smooth, unbroken skin. Whatever this machine was, it was doing its job. John let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "All right," he said quietly. "That's one problem solved. Now, about the next." His voice trailed off as the humming sound of the force field intensified. He turned toward the edge of the dome, his stomach sinking. Shadows moved just beyond the barrier. The creatures hadn't left. They had surrounded the safe zone, waiting for an opportunity to strike. "Kid," he said, his voice low but urgent. "We've got company." The child looked up, her eyes wide with alarm. She ran to John's side, clutching the pendant tightly. It pulsed faintly, as if in response to the looming danger. John's grip on his rifle tightened. Any chance this dome has weapons? Some kind of defense system? The child didn't answer, her focus shifting between the pendant and the creatures outside. John couldn't tell if she didn't understand him or if she simply didn't know the answer. "Figures," he muttered, scanning the dome for anything he could use. His gaze fell on a set of strange-looking panels near the platform. They glowed faintly, their symbols similar to the ones on the cradle. He had no idea what they were, but at this point, he was willing to take a risk. "Stay here," he told the child, moving toward the panels. He placed his hand on one, and the symbols lit up. The air around him seemed to shift, growing heavier with energy. Suddenly, a series of drones emerged from hidden compartments in the walls, their sleek alien design unlike anything he had ever seen. "Well, that's new," John said, watching the drones hover around him. The child's eyes lit up with hope. She gestured toward the drones, then toward the creatures outside. John didn't need an explanation. He nodded, gripping his rifle. "Let's see what these things can do." As the drones aligned themselves at the edge of the dome, ready to engage, John felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Determination. The odds were against them, but he wasn't going to let that stop him. He had made a promise to protect the mother and child, and he intended to keep it, no matter what came next. A desperate gamble. The safe zone, despite its advanced technology, felt fragile under the weight of what surrounded it. The creatures outside the shimmering dome circled relentlessly, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. Their guttural growls echoed, a grim reminder that they were only moments away from another attack. John tightened his grip on his rifle, his mind racing for solutions. The alien woman, though still unconscious, now seemed stable, her breathing even, and the blue glow of her veins fading to a healthier hue. Whatever the child had activated in the medical platform was working. But John knew that time was running out. The safe zone wouldn't hold forever, and those creatures wouldn't give up. The child tugged on his sleeve, her pendant glowing faintly. She pointed at the holographic map that still hovered over the platform, the green dot indicating their current location. Surrounding it were several red dots, moving rapidly toward them. Reinforcements, John guessed, his voice low. The child shook her head vigorously, her expression grave. He crouched down to her level. "What's coming?" he asked. She hesitated, then used her small fingers to swipe across the hologram. A new image appeared, a massive, sleek ship hovering above the planet's surface. John's jaw tightened. Great. More bad news. The child pointed to the ship and then back to the red dots on the map. Her expression was one of urgency, as if she was trying to explain something crucial. Finally, she pointed to herself, then to John, and then to the pendant. "You're saying the thing can stop them?" John asked, gesturing to the glowing pendant. The child nodded. John stared at her for a moment, the weight of her meaning sinking in. The pendant wasn't just a tool. It was a beacon, a key, or maybe even a weapon. And she wanted him to use it. "All right," he said, standing up. "Show me how." The child placed the pendant into John's hands. The moment it touched his skin, it pulsed with a warmth that sent a shiver down his spine. Symbols danced across its surface, shifting and rearranging themselves as if responding to his touch. "Let's hope this doesn't blow us all up," he muttered. The child pointed to the edge of the dome, where the creatures were now testing the barrier with increasing aggression. Their claws scratched against the energy field, sending sparks into the air. One of them reared back and slammed its massive body against the barrier, causing it to ripple dangerously. John held the pendant up, its glow intensifying. The creatures froze, their glowing eyes narrowing as they backed away slightly. The child gestured urgently, indicating that he needed to do something more. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked, frustration creeping into his voice. The child stepped forward and touched the pendant. A sharp beam of light shot out from it, striking the center of the dome's floor. The entire safe zone seemed to react, the humming sound growing louder. Symbols appeared on the ground, forming a circular pattern around the platform. John took a deep breath. "Okay, here goes nothing." He stepped into the center of the symbols, the pendant still in his hand. The moment he did, the energy in the room surged. The symbols on the ground began to spin, their light intensifying until the entire dome was bathed in a brilliant glow. Outside, the creatures howled, retreating further into the shadows. The pendant emitted a series of sharp, rhythmic pulses. It wasn't just light. It was sending out a signal. John could feel it vibrating through his body, resonating in his chest. The child stood at his side, her tiny hand gripping his arm for support. Then, as suddenly as it began, the light dimmed. The humming stopped. The creatures outside had gone silent. John lowered the pendant, his heart pounding. "Did it work?" he asked, glancing at the child. She nodded, but her expression was far from relieved. A deep rumble filled the air, shaking the ground beneath their feet. John turned toward the edge of the dome, his stomach sinking. In the distance, the sleek ship from the hologram was descending, its massive engines glowing with an unnatural red light. "Of course," John muttered. "Why would it be that easy?" The child pointed to the medical platform, where her mother was now stirring, her eyes fluttering open. She looked disoriented but alive, her silver eyes locking onto John and the child. She spoke in their language, her tone urgent. "What's she saying?" John asked the child. The girl hesitated, then said in a small voice, "Run." John's jaw tightened. Not an option. The alien woman struggled to sit up, her gaze sharp despite her weakened state. She reached out, touching the pendant in John's hand. It flared with light again, projecting another hologram. This one showed the interior of the descending ship, filled with heavily armed soldiers and a figure at the helm, a towering alien with cruel, calculating eyes. "Let me guess," John said, studying the image. "That's the boss." The woman nodded, her expression grim. She spoke again, her voice stronger this time. The child translated. "They're here for her." John's grip on the pendant tightened. "They're not getting her. Or you." The alien woman shook her head, speaking quickly. The child translated again, her voice trembling. She says, "You can't fight them. Not all of them." "Watch me," John said, leveling his rifle. But the woman grabbed his arm, her eyes pleading. She pointed to the pendant and then to the ship. "Beacon," the child translated. "It can call for help." "Help? From who?" John asked, but the woman didn't answer. She pressed the pendant back into his hands, her expression clear. This was their only chance. The rumbling outside grew louder as the ship landed, its massive doors beginning to open. John glanced at the child, then at the woman. He didn't trust alien technology, but he trusted them. He had to. "Fine," he said, gripping the pendant. "Let's see what this thing can really do." As he activated the pendant again, the air around them shifted. The dome's energy flared, brighter than ever before, and a pulse shot out into the night sky. It wasn't just a signal. It was a call to war. And someone out there had heard it, protecting the innocent. The air outside the shimmering dome crackled with tension. The towering alien ship loomed like a predator over its prey, its massive engines humming ominously as soldiers began disembarking, clad in armor that seemed to shimmer with the same eerie glow as the creatures outside. The soldiers moved with precision and purpose, their weapons trained on the dome. John could feel the pressure mounting. They were running out of time. Inside, the pendant in his hand pulsed rhythmically, as though alive and aware of the danger. The alien woman sat upright now, her strength returning faster than John could have expected. Her silver eyes, sharp and filled with resolve, locked onto his. "She's trying to say something," John muttered, glancing at the child. The girl nodded, her voice trembling but steady. "Mother says, they won't stop, not until they have us." John frowned, gripping his rifle. "Not happening." The alien woman spoke again, her tone urgent. The child translated, her small hands gripping the glowing pendant tightly. She says, "The pendant can protect us, but only if you fight." "Great," John muttered. No pressure. Outside, the soldiers were setting up some kind of device. It emitted a low hum, and the dome's shimmering energy began to flicker. They were trying to break through. John had faced tough odds before, but this was something else entirely. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for a mother and child whose lives depended on him. "All right," John said, turning to the alien woman. "How does this thing work? Can it do more than just flash pretty lights?" The woman reached out, her fingers brushing the pendant. It flared brightly, casting holographic symbols into the air. She spoke quickly, her voice firm despite her obvious exhaustion. The child translated, her words tumbling out in a rush. She says, "The pendant can control the dome. It can attack them, but it needs you to guide it." "Guide it," John repeated, incredulous. "I'm not exactly fluent in alien tech." The woman gave him a look that said it didn't matter. She gestured at the pendant, then at him, her meaning clear. He had to try. John let out a slow breath. "Okay, let's do this." He placed the pendant around his neck. The moment it rested against his chest, it came to life, projecting a swirling array of symbols and patterns into the air. The child stepped forward, her small hands moving through the holograms with practiced ease. The symbols shifted and rearranged, forming what looked like a control interface. "Now what?" John asked, glancing at the child. The girl pointed at a glowing red symbol in the hologram. "Touch," she said simply. John hesitated, then reached out and pressed the symbol. The dome around them pulsed brightly, and suddenly, beams of energy shot out from its surface, targeting the soldiers outside. The beams were precise, disabling their weapons and forcing them to retreat temporarily. "Nice," John said, a small grin tugging at his lips. "That'll buy us some time." But the respite was short-lived. The soldiers quickly regrouped, their leader, a massive, armored alien with a cruel, angular face, stepping forward. He raised a hand, and the soldiers activated another device. This one emitted a high-pitched sound that made John wince. The dome flickered again, its energy destabilizing. "Not good," John muttered. He turned to the child. "What else can this thing do?" The child pointed at another symbol, her expression serious. "Strong attack," she said. "Strong attack it is," John replied, pressing the symbol. The dome flared again, and this time, a wave of energy rippled outward, knocking the soldiers off their feet. The leader, however, remained standing, his armored frame absorbing the impact. He bellowed something in a harsh, guttural language, and the soldiers began advancing again, undeterred. John gritted his teeth. "They're not giving up." The alien woman spoke again, her voice firm despite her weakened state. The child translated, her voice trembling. "Mother says, the pendant can't hold them off forever. We need to leave." "Leave? And go where?" John asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "We're surrounded." The child pointed at the hologram, where a new symbol had appeared, a blue dot on the edge of the map. "Safe place," she said. "Portal." "A portal?" John echoed, his mind racing. "You're telling me there's a way out of here?" The child nodded. "But we must hurry." John glanced at the map, then at the soldiers outside. The dome was their only protection, but it wouldn't last much longer. If this portal was their only chance, he had to take it. "Okay," he said, tightening his grip on his rifle. "How do we get there?" The child gestured at the pendant. "It will guide." John nodded, turning to the alien woman. "Can you walk?" She nodded, though her movements were still slow and deliberate. John helped her to her feet, her weight leaning heavily on him. The child clutched the pendant, her small frame radiating determination. "Stay close," John said, his voice steady. "We move fast, and we don't stop." As the dome's energy began to fail, the three of them stepped toward the edge. The pendant pulsed brightly, projecting a path through the chaos. John's heart pounded as the soldiers outside raised their weapons, their leader barking orders. "Go!" he shouted, leading the charge. The world outside the dome was chaos. Energy blasts and alien weapons lit up the night as John and the others sprinted toward the portal. The pendant's light guided them, creating a protective barrier that deflected incoming attacks. The soldiers closed in, their relentless pursuit driving John to his limits. His rifle barked out in sharp bursts, providing cover as the portal came into view. A swirling vortex of blue light, hovering impossibly in the air. "Almost there," John yelled. The alien woman stumbled, her strength waning. John caught her, slinging her arm over his shoulder as they pushed forward. The child ran ahead, her small figure dwarfed by the chaos around her. As they reached the portal, the pendant flared one final time, its energy surging outward in a blinding wave. The soldiers were thrown back, their weapons useless against the sheer force of the blast. John didn't hesitate. He grabbed the child's hand and stepped into the portal, the alien woman beside him. The world dissolved into light, and for a moment there was only silence. Then they were gone, an unlikely alliance. The portal spat them out into a strange, surreal landscape. The air shimmered with faint hues of gold and blue, and the ground beneath their feet felt both solid and fluid, as if it were alive. Towering crystalline structures surrounded them, pulsing faintly with energy. It was unlike anything John had ever seen. And yet, it felt peaceful. The alien woman staggered as she exited the portal, leaning heavily on John for support. The child clung to her mother's side, her silver eyes scanning their surroundings with a mix of awe and fear. John took a moment to steady himself, his rifle still clutched tightly in one hand. "Where are we?" he muttered, his voice echoing in the stillness. The child pointed toward a glowing pathway that snaked through the crystalline terrain. "Safe place," she said softly. For now." "For now," John repeated, his brow furrowing. He glanced over his shoulder at the swirling portal behind them, its energy slowly fading. "Does that mean they can follow us?" The child didn't answer, but her silence was telling. John let out a frustrated sigh, his grip on the rifle tightening. They might have bought themselves some time, but the fight wasn't over yet. "Let's keep moving," he said, nodding toward the pathway. "Whatever this place is, it's better than being out in the open." The alien woman murmured something in her melodic language, her voice faint but steady. The child translated. "Mother says, this is a sanctuary, but not for long. We must reach the core." "The core?" John asked, raising an eyebrow. The child pointed toward the largest crystalline structure in the distance. It towered above the rest, its surface shimmering with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the light. "There," she said. "It will protect us." John glanced at the alien woman, who nodded weakly. He didn't fully understand, but he trusted her judgment. She had gotten them this far, and right now, that was enough. They set off down the glowing pathway, the alien child leading the way while John kept a watchful eye on their surroundings. The crystalline structures hummed softly as they passed, their light growing brighter with each step. The air felt charged, almost electric, and John couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Stay close," he said, his voice low. The child looked back at him and nodded, her small hand clutching the pendant tightly. As they walked, the alien woman began to speak again, her voice stronger than before. The child translated as they went, her words painting a vivid picture. "Mother says, the pendant is part of a network, a key. It can activate the core and send a signal, a call for allies." John frowned. "Allies? From where?" The child hesitated, then said, "Far away, beyond your stars." "Great," John muttered. "Let's hope they get here fast." The ground beneath them suddenly trembled, a low rumble that sent ripples through the crystalline terrain. John froze, his rifle snapping up instinctively. The child gasped, clinging to her mother's side. "What was that?" John asked, his eyes scanning the horizon. The alien woman spoke quickly, her tone urgent. The child translated, her voice trembling. "Mother says, they found us." John swore under his breath. Of course they have. In the distance, the air shimmered as another portal began to form. This one was larger and darker, its energy crackling with red lightning. Shadows moved within it, growing larger and more distinct with each passing second. "They're coming," John said, his voice grim. He turned to the child. "How far to the core?" The child pointed to the towering structure in the distance. "Not far, but we must hurry." John nodded. "Then we run." They took off down the pathway, the alien woman struggling to keep up but refusing to slow down. John kept glancing over his shoulder, his heart pounding as the figures emerging from the portal became clearer. Soldiers, more numerous and heavily armed than before, poured out onto the crystalline terrain. Leading them was the same towering alien commander, his cold, calculating eyes fixed on the fleeing trio. "They're faster this time," John muttered, his mind racing. "We need a plan." The alien child suddenly stopped, turning to face the soldiers. Her pendant glowed brightly, its energy pulsing in rhythmic waves. John skidded to a halt, panic flashing across his face. "What are you doing?" he demanded. The child didn't answer. She held the pendant high, and its light intensified, sending out a powerful shockwave that rippled through the air. The soldiers staggered, their advance momentarily halted. The alien commander growled, barking orders to his troops. "That won't hold them for long," John said, grabbing the child's arm and pulling her forward. "Come on, we have to keep moving." The core was closer now, its massive structure looming over them like a guardian. As they approached, the pathway began to shift, the crystals rearranging themselves to form steps leading upward. The air grew warmer, and the hum of energy became almost deafening. John turned to the alien woman. "What happens when we get there? How does this thing protect us?" The child answered for her, her voice steady, despite the fear in her eyes. "The core will shield us. And send the call." "Let's hope it works," John muttered. They climbed the steps, the alien woman leaning heavily on John for support. The child led the way, her small figure dwarfed by the towering structure. Behind them, the soldiers regrouped, their weapons trained on the glowing pathway. As they reached the top, the core came into view. It was a massive, pulsating crystal, its surface etched with intricate symbols that glowed with a blinding light. The child placed the pendant into a small indentation at its center, and the entire structure came alive. The light from the core erupted outward, forming a protective barrier around them. The soldiers' weapons were rendered useless, their energy blasts absorbed by the shield. The alien commander roared in frustration, his eyes blazing with fury. John watched as the core began to emit a low, melodic tone that seemed to resonate through the very fabric of the air. The light from the core grew brighter, sending out beams of energy that shot into the sky. "What's it doing?" John asked, shielding his eyes. The child looked at him, her expression calm despite the chaos around them, calling for help. "Let's hope someone answers," John said, his voice grim. The soldiers continued their assault, but the core's shield held firm. John tightened his grip on his rifle, ready for whatever came next. He didn't know who or what would respond to the call, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going down without a fight. A new beginning. The core's radiant light intensified, bathing the crystalline landscape in a kaleidoscope of colors. John shielded his eyes, his heart pounding as the melodic hum grew louder, reverberating through the ground beneath his feet. It was as if the entire planet was responding to the call. The alien woman, leaning heavily on him, murmured softly in her language, her silver eyes fixed on the core. The child stood beside her, clutching her mother's hand, her face a mixture of hope and fear. Above them, the sky began to change. The stars flickered, their light shifting in response to the energy radiating from the core. John didn't know what was happening, but he could feel it. Something was coming. "Do you think this will work?" he asked, glancing at the child. She looked up at him, her expression serious. "It must." Below, the soldiers regrouped, their leader roaring commands in his guttural language. The red lightning of their portal still crackled ominously, and reinforcements continued to pour through. Despite the core's protective barrier, the alien commander showed no signs of retreat. He raised a massive weapon, its barrel glowing with a sinister red energy. John's eyes narrowed. "That doesn't look good." The weapon fired, sending a searing blast toward the core's barrier. The impact shook the ground, causing cracks to form into crystalline steps beneath them. The barrier flickered but held. For now. "They're not giving up," John muttered, gripping his rifle. He turned to the alien woman. "If this thing is calling for help, how long until it gets here?" The child translated her mother's response, her voice trembling. "Soon, but not fast enough." "Figures," John said grimly. He scanned the advancing soldiers, his mind racing. They couldn't hold out much longer. The core's light might be powerful, but it wasn't invincible. He had to buy them more time. "Stay here," he told the child and her mother. "I'll handle this." The child's eyes widened in alarm. "No, too dangerous." "Everything about this is dangerous," John replied. "But I didn't come this far to quit now." Before either of them could argue, he turned and sprinted down the steps, his rifle raised. The soldiers were closing in, their weapons trained on the core. John fired a series of precise shots, taking down several of them and drawing their attention. "Come on, you ugly bastards," he shouted, his voice echoing across the battlefield. "You want to fight? You've got one." The soldiers turned their focus to him, their weapons lighting up with deadly precision. John darted between the crystalline structures, using them as cover as he returned fire. The alien commander snarled, his cold, calculating eyes locking onto John. With a guttural roar, he ordered his troops to pursue. "Good," John muttered under his breath, his heart pounding. "Keep your eyes on me." The chase was intense. John's combat instincts took over as he navigated the terrain, leading the soldiers away from the core. Explosions erupted around him, the crystalline ground shattering under the relentless assault. Despite the odds, he pressed on, determined to give the alien woman and her child the time they needed. Meanwhile, at the core, the child knelt beside her mother, their hands clasped tightly around the glowing pendant. The core's energy surged, its light shooting upward in a brilliant beam that pierced the heavens. The melodic hum grew louder, reaching a crescendo that resonated across the battlefield. Then the sky tore open. A massive ship emerged from the rift, its sleek, silver surface gleaming in the core's light. It was unlike anything John had ever seen, graceful yet imposing, with an aura of immense power. The alien soldiers froze, their weapons lowering as they stared up at the sky in disbelief. John skidded to a halt, his breath catching as he looked up at the ship. What the hell? The ship descended slowly, its presence dominating the landscape. Smaller crafts emerged from its hull, speeding toward the battlefield. As they landed, figures stepped out, tall, regal beings with features similar to the alien woman and her child. They were armed, their movements fluid and purposeful, and their expressions were cold as they surveyed the scene. The alien commander roared, rallying his troops. The soldiers raised their weapons, but the newcomers were faster. Energy blasts lit up the battlefield as the reinforcements engaged the enemy with precision and efficiency. It was clear they were highly trained, their technology far superior to that of the invaders. John watched in awe as the tide of the battle turned. The soldiers who had been pursuing him were now in full retreat, their ranks decimated by the newcomers' assault. The alien commander, however, refused to back down. He charged toward the core, his massive weapon glowing with deadly energy. "Not so fast," John muttered, raising his rifle. He fired a well-placed shot that struck the commander's weapon, causing it to explode in his hands. The commander roared in fury, his gaze snapping to John. "Yeah, come on," John said, squaring his shoulders. "Let's finish this." The commander lunged, his massive frame barreling toward John. But before he could strike, one of the newcomers intercepted him, their energy blades slicing through his armor with deadly precision. The commander fell, his lifeless body hitting the ground with a heavy thud. The battlefield fell silent. John lowered his rifle, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The newcomers turned to him, their expressions unreadable. Then one of them stepped forward, their gaze shifting to the core. The alien woman and her child emerged, their faces lighting up with relief. "Friends of yours?" John asked, his voice hoarse. The child nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Allies." The newcomer approached the alien woman, bowing deeply before speaking in their melodic language. The child translated for John. "They say, we are safe now, thanks to you." John let out a long breath, the weight of the ordeal finally hitting him. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Glad I could help." As the newcomers secured the battlefield and tended to the injured, John stood with the alien woman and her child, watching the sunrise over the crystalline landscape. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a sense of peace. "This isn't the end, is it?" he asked, glancing at the child. She shook her head. "No, but It's a new beginning. John smiled, his hand resting on the pendant around his neck. Good. I could use one of those. And with that, their journey continued, bound together by trust, courage, and the hope for a brighter future.